Hello, teacher friends. Today we're going to talk about teaching IELTS on iTalki. I've gotten a few requests from fellow teachers and some subscribers to make a video like this. So thank you for those people who have given me this suggestion, and I really hope that this pushes people in the right direction and is a good manual for getting started on iTalki as an IELTS preparation teacher. This is not going to make you an expert on the exam itself or on how to prepare students for the exam. I'll actually publish a video later this week talking about how to be an exceptional IELTS preparation teacher. But I hope that this at least is a good way to get started if you're thinking about teaching IELTS on iTalki. So I'm going to start off by talking about who can be an IELTS preparation teacher. From there, I'm going to talk about why you should become an IELTS preparation teacher on iTalki. I'll talk about how much you could charge, how much you could make. From there, I'll talk about the students that you may encounter and why this is important. I'll walk you through the first steps of how to get started, and I'll talk about my experiences. And at the end, I'll give you some tips. But again, this won't be an extensive guide to teaching on iTalki as an IELTS teacher, but I hope that it's a good platform to get you started. So let's get started right here. So what is iTalki to start off? It's the International English Language Testing System. It is a test that a lot of students use in order to migrate to a different place for work and for study. Yeah, it's offered in countless countries across the globe, and it tests all four skills of the students. Yeah, who could teach IELTS on iTalki? Well, basically anybody who has a TEFL, TESOL, TESOL, CELTA certificate. Yeah, so you need some sort of teaching certification. This kind of ties in with the importance of just becoming a certified teacher in the first place. If you are passionate enough about teaching to help students with their with such an incredible journey of immigrating or going to study or just working in a different country, if you are that passionate and invested, then I trust that you are also passionate or invested enough to try to pursue some certification, or at least this may appeal to some people. So I'll put down in the description a few programs that I found online that will allow you to teach, to learn to be a teacher, to train to get your TEFL or your TESOL certification. And again, I'll talk more about that in the future. But that's the first thing you need. You need the professional teacher title on iTalki to be an IELTS teacher. From there, what would I suggest? Well, I would suggest 1 to 2 years of exposure to teaching, especially if you're a native English speaker. But see, this is interesting because I know that there are some professional teachers who have actually taken the IELTS test because they are not native English speakers, but they are incredibly proficient. In fact, they're fluent in standard English. So for those people, I say, why not dive right into it? If you have TESOL, TEFL, then I'd say jump right on in and start the process. If you feel, again, that comfortable and you feel that your lessons are worth the price. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. I've had some students come to my class. I had a student who came to my class for interview preparation because she wanted to be an IELTS preparation instructor, and she wanted me to help her prepare. And she came from a different country, and in fact English is not her native language, but she has gone through the process of taking the IELTS exam. So I think that there's great value in that as well. And I think that your students will find great value in that as well, if you're able to empathize to that extent. So that's who could become an IELTS teacher on iTalki. Now, why become one? Well, first of all, I'll just cut right to the chase, the money. Students pay more to find a good teacher who's able to help them prepare for IELTS. They do pay more. Aside from that, I think that it gives you exposure to a lot more students. Honestly, like teaching IELTS pretty much carried me through my first year on iTalki. I'd say at some point 70% of my students were IELTS students. Like that is those were all the students, or almost all the students that I was teaching. So this is a real big part of my iTalki experience, a very big part of my ESOL teaching experience. So I think that just your exposure to different students from different parts of the world who have different goals and aspirations for learning English, this could open up a whole new world, a whole new cohort and demographic of who you're teaching on iTalki. So those are the two main reasons why I would say get into it. And maybe the third one are it's job prospects outside of iTalki. I mean, having this kind of experience freelance online, that could really transfer to outside the virtual world, and to, you know, maybe you want to be an examiner one day as well, and this kind of experience could really help you. So I think that test prep in general, whether it be TOEFL or IELTS, but we're speaking about IELTS today, I think that could really help you out. Perfect. Number 3, how much to charge. So this is where it's important to talk about the similarities and differences between IELTS classes and general English classes, because I mean, a lot of the time, a lot of the tips I could give you in terms of the correction, like the implicit or explicit feedback, in terms of how you conduct your classes, in terms of your methodology and approaches, kind of overlap between general English and test prep. And I think that some of the main differences with test prep is that it's obviously more form focused. You're focusing on specific kind of technical structures of English, like the grammar and the pronunciation, I suppose, because there is a scheme. And we'll talk about the format and the criteria in a moment. But there are a lot of similarities right here. So this is another similarity. How much should you charge for IELTS lessons? It kind of is the same as conversational and general English. It depends a lot on you. It depends on how much free time you have and how important iTalki is to your, you know, your core meat and potatoes budget. It also depends on your experience. It depends on how long you've been teaching for and how vast and diverse your experience is as a teacher. And it's kind of supply and demand as well. I mean, depending on what country you're from, I'll talk about my students in a moment and how me being a Canadian IELTS iTalki teacher, see, we're really getting into the niche now, but how this has actually given me a different experience in comparison to students from, teachers from other countries, even England or Australia, for example. So I think that all of these could kind of dictate your price. What did I start off at? Well, I started off at probably $10 a pop for an hour. Since then, the prices on iTalki have gone up, and so have mine, right? So I'll talk a little bit more about my prices on iTalki in a moment. But I would suggest starting with some sort of deal, maybe $10 for an hour, if you could afford that, depending on what country you're living in. If not, it could be $15 for an hour. But either or, I think you should be giving some sort of deal to really get started off, especially if you want this to be, like, it all comes down to how much you want this how active you want iTalki to be in your life, and what proportion of your time you want to dedicate to it. If you want to be teaching 20 classes a week at some point, or 30 classes, just IELTS classes a week, I'd start off at 12 or 13 bucks an hour. Wait maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and once you have a few students, then you could start raising it. Yeah. All right, perfect. For the students. So I'll tell you right now that most of the students on iTalki are students who are, most of your students will come from, will have a specific reason for taking the IELTS exam. Some of them will want to take lessons for the long term. Some of them will want to take lessons for the short term. And some of them may want to take a lesson for one day, in fact. I've had students who have booked an IELTS lesson, and they have an IELTS exam the next day. They just want to practice speaking. That's it. And we practice, and I never see them again. They just want a native English speaker to practice with, right? Some of your students have a specific date, and the date is like 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 2 months from now, and they want to work towards that. Yeah. Some of your students, it's long term. They have no idea when they're going to go for this lesson. And again, this is where general English and IELTS English come together, because some of these students are actually quite low level, or low for what the IELTS band score, the required band score is to basically be able to immigrate to a country like Canada, or to be able to study in a country like Canada. And they just want to kind of get started, and just get the ball rolling with lessons, but they could be taking lessons for 20, 30, 40, 50 classes, right? So remember that you have those three cohorts, and I think you should, I suggest when you go to your first lesson with one of these students, to be prepared for that this could be the only class you have with this student, or it could be one of many classes. And again, as I've explained in other lessons, it's really useful to message your student beforehand to try to find out what their goals are for the lesson. And sometimes they won't message you back. So try to show up prepared for either of these three scenarios. Awesome. First steps. Let's talk about first steps. So you're starting off on iTalki as an IELTS teacher. It's really exciting. So the first thing I think you should do is learn the band scheme. All right, and compare this to the CEFR, A1, A2, B1, B2, yada yada, and try to find the similarities and differences between these, because of course, as I said, a lot of the students who are coming for your help, a lot of them are actually probably around band 5.5 or to band 6.5, and they're trying to make it to band 7. Right? So understanding how these bands equate to the CEFR, or whatever you're comfortable with. Maybe like me, as a Canadian teacher, you use the Canadian language benchmark. It really depends on what country you're from, but whatever tool you're using to assess students and to kind of craft your curriculum, I think that you could profit from starting with the band scheme, understanding the band scores. And that goes into the format of the test. You need to know the format of the test. Well, there are two types of IELTS tests, and one is general and one is academic, right? So those kind of speak for themselves. General is for immigration and for work, whereas academic is usually for school, right? Getting acquainted with the different formats of the tests, the different parts of reading, for example, or speaking or writing, could be really useful. But again, this ties in with your students. From my experience, most of my students come for speaking and writing help exclusively, and I'll speak more about that in a second as well. Yeah, I think learning the format is really important. From there, I suggest learning frequently asked questions, or the answers to frequently asked questions. because a lot of the questions that most of my students show up with two or three questions that I'd like never heard before, and some of them seem pretty simple. Am I allowed to wear a watch during the exam? Like, will there be a clock? Could I drink water? Where do I go when I first get there? Should I show up early? Right? And you're just going to learn these along the way. So don't stress if you don't know. Again, this ties in with just being a teacher in general. If you don't know, that's okay. But I think that we could help prepare ourselves to the best of our ability. So I'll throw this link into the description as well. Frequently asked questions. This is a great way to really build rapport with your students, because I think it's going outside of the exam a little bit. Like, it's associated with the exam, but it's also outside of it. And you're giving your students kind of insight on the actual experience of going to the exam. For even in terms of the style, what will the examiner be like? Will they interrupt you? Or will they just wait for you to finish? These are all questions that I've been asked. So try to at least have resources ready to send to your students, so that you could go over them with them when they ask these questions. Perfect. Number 3, resources and textbooks. So for me, I do have a couple textbooks that I use. I like to use the official Cambridge Guide to IELTS, and I've also used Road to IELTS as well. I found that as I go through, there isn't too much that you need to pay for that is not available for free online. But on the topic of things being free, sometimes it's low quality, and there are a lot of resources online, a lot of free IELTS resources that are just riddled with spelling mistakes and grammatical errors and punctuation errors. And I know this isn't the end all or be all, but I mean, really, when your students are in a very vulnerable position of studying for this exam, which is quite expensive, and the preparation is quite expensive, they could take a lot of things as the letter of the law, right? So they could see a mistake and they could just internalize that. And if nobody tells them that's wrong, then it's there, right? It's crystallized in their mind. So I think understanding the free resources online is a very good alternative to not paying for a resource. I've had some students who like using my resources. Some of them don't. And honestly, at this point, I don't really use these textbooks at all, because I am able to filter out all of the misinformation from the free resources. I have a very simple, cut and dry method and strategy that I use with my students, and they prefer my kind of handcrafted curriculum more than actually learning from the book. And the results speak for themselves. So I think that from my perspective, textbooks are not needed, but they could be a good way of, throwing $50 towards a textbook could be a good way to show that you're serious about what you're doing. And it could be a kind of good backup plan to use with your students. And it could help you as a new IELTS teacher on iTalki to really to learn more about the test. All right, cool. Number 4 for getting started, and this should be like the first thing that you do when you're in class. Learn about your students' goals. Learn about their goals. What band score do they want? I didn't ask this for such a long time when I first got started. I just assumed, what band score do they want? What's their goal? And I know you should aim for their score to be as high as possible. But I think that having an achievable goal is a really important thing. And the time frame, like the date of the exam, when are they planning to take the exam? It's this is one of the biggest mistakes I made when I first got started, and in the first few months, there was just no specific date um, from my perspective. And now I have a Google Doc or a Google spreadsheet basically. And from the trial lesson, I have it for my IELTS students, one for my general English, one for my conversational English. But for the IELTS students, I have their name, I have the goal that they want, the band score that they want, and the date of the exam or the possible date of the exam. Boom, boom, boom. And this is a really good way to kind of make a plan with your students, right? Perfect. Number 5, learn the criteria of the test. I think that learning the band scores is great, but also look at the band explanations as well. And again, compared to the CEFR, there's a great way that you could kind of borrow give and take activities that are IELTS based to those that are general English based and vice versa. So those would be kind of the first things to do when you're getting started as an IELTS teacher, to get acquainted with these things and diving deeper into it, understanding just in general some intel on the IELTS exam and IELTS scores. Like, what band do a lot of universities or colleges in Canada require? And does it depend on the program as well? Express entry to Canada, what band score does this require? Like, all of these things could be the questions that your students ask you, and for some students it could be make or break. But I'll go into that in later videos. All right, my experiences. Yes, I could talk about myself now. So I began teaching IELTS prep shortly after beginning on iTalki. I really began in December of 2019, and I began IELTS prep in maybe January of 2020. But when did I begin IELTS prep in general? Well, I have been incredibly lucky as an ESL, EFL, ESOL teacher to an a very unfair extent. When I came back from my first teaching experience in Thailand, I was hired by a school in Toronto, and they asked me, "Do you want to teach IELTS prep?" I had maybe I had heard the acronym once or twice, but I had no idea. I didn't know anything. I didn't know skill training or anything like that. And they gave me the job, and I got started, and I dove right in, and I started with listening and speaking practice, and that was my first exposure to IELTS. From there, when I was in Ireland, I was given an opportunity to teach at a university IELTS preparation, which was just incredible. So I was teaching a lot of asylum seekers. In Ireland, they really did it right. The school that had me on contract, they actually gave me proper textbooks to use. Great resources. Also, one of my colleagues trained me to teach IELTS as well. So I actually received comprehensive training. All of this was free. It was just fantastic. So I really got lucky. And I know a lot of potential teachers don't have this opportunity. So that's one of the reasons why I do suggest, I'll put this in the tips as well. I do suggest if you don't have these resources, to at least take a little course. I took one with the Canadian College of Educators. Oh God, how much did it cost? Maybe $150, but don't quote me on that. And it was like a 10 or 15 hour course online for IELTS preparation. I actually took that a few months ago to brush up on my IELTS knowledge, to make sure that I cross my T's and dot my I's, right? But if you're a little bit hesitant about the course and you just want to get a really good overview, it could be worth it, because $150 you put towards this certification there you go. You have it on your IELTS, on your iTalki page. And then that permits you, that just gives you that extra layer of security while you're teaching IELTS on iTalki. So I really do suggest doing that. While saying that, this certification is basically a bunch of YouTube videos that you're watching. I mean, it's incredible that you're paying for it, because really it's a bunch of free resources. But these free resources are compiled and they're organized, and that's exactly what your students are paying for from you. They're basically paying for all this information that most of it is available on Reddit or somewhere online, but you as a professional teacher are organizing it and putting it into one space. Yeah, exactly. So I started in January with a good amount of knowledge of IELTS, and the vast majority of my students over the next 3 or 4 months were Russian students, intermediate, meaning maybe B2, B1 or B2 level, who wanted to come to Canada for general IELTS training. And this was my niche. Really, I had so many students coming. A lot of them were asking questions about Canada as well. So be prepared for that. You'll be treated as a little bit of a travel agent, depending on your country, perhaps. This is, as I said, what kind of got me through the quarantine. I mean, most of my students, most of my classes were coming from here. Yeah, I started off at like maybe $10 an hour, and it was just waves of students. So after 3 or 4 months, I brought it up to 20. Yeah, it was heartbreaking because some of my students I had to cut off because they weren't able to afford the lessons. But I was able to build relationships with a lot of students. And this is one tip to you all as teachers. You know, you'll have one day, perhaps short-term and long-term IELTS students, as I spoke about before. Some of your students will actually take IELTS and then they'll stay and take conversational lessons after they take IELTS. I had a student who took IELTS, took its exam, and I helped him prepare. And since then, he's probably taken 100 conversational lessons. Like this does happen. And you have it the other way around. You have students who start conversational or general English, and then they work their way up to IELTS prep as well. Yeah. I learned a lot as a teacher in general from teaching IELTS preparation, because I learned a lot about my strengths and weaknesses as a teacher. I learned that a lot of the students who struggle with IELTS, these difficulties translate to personal difficulties that they actually have. This could be anxiety. This could be speaking too fast. This could be trailing off in conversation. These are things that they do in their own native language as well. This could be dyslexia. Yeah. And some of these things you might be prepared for, some of these things you're not prepared for, right? But again, this could happen in general English, but I think the level of vulnerability from your students in IELTS prep really gets you to kind of put things into action and work through these difficulties in a limited amount of time. Yeah. And again, I'll talk more about this in my future video where I talk about how to be an exceptional teacher. But this is just to get you started. So overall, I've taught probably 500 or 600 IELTS lessons on iTalki over the past year or year and a half, I guess. Probably 100 to 150 of my students have been IELTS preparation students. I suggest that you offer packages. Package deals have been fantastic for me for IELTS preparation. And that's pretty much my experience. Recently, I've been teaching more general English lessons. Yeah. But IELTS has really helped me, statistically speaking, on iTalki as well. So now let's finish off with some tips. So my first tip, as I said before, professional development. Never stop trying to develop professionally, even if it's outside of certification. But if you do want to get certification, it does help. And I think that the Canadian College of Educators program is not fantastic, but that's one example of an online IELTS teacher's certificate that you could take to help you out. Number two, take the exam. If you're really getting started, take the exam. Do a little mock exam. A lot of my students are speaking and writing students. They want to focus on speaking and writing because reading and listening the answers are automated. They could find the answers automatically. So unless if they really have struggles in these areas, a lot of them just take speaking and writing lessons with me, and these could be tricky because it could be quite subjective in some regards. So this could be a really good chance for you to focus on transfer errors that your students make from their L1 to L plus, right? Yeah, I suggest that you use resources. You use these resources in general English as well. I never realized this until recently that I could definitely use a process diagram to teach my general English students skills, right? And the vocabulary, describing graphs, describing pie charts, describing trends. This could be used in their work as well. So make use of these IELTS resources in your general English classes. Don't restrict students to IELTS. Yeah, in my lessons, this is what my lesson typically looks like. I have a process that I go through with my students for maybe 10 or 15 lessons. And that is just to acquaint them with IELTS. But some of my students know everything about IELTS. They know almost as much as I do. They just need practice. Yeah. So once you get to that point, it might be the first class, it might be 5 classes in, 10 classes in. Once you get to that point, or once I get to that point with the given student, I usually give them I usually structure the class by starting with a TBLT, a task basically. It could be a picture-based task or some activity. Maybe it could be looking at confusing words in English, defining different words, using circumlocution to find the meanings of words. After that, we look at their writing homework from the previous lesson. So we look at task 1, task 2. After that, we usually go through a few strategies for writing, and we work on whatever they have to work on. And then we have a couple speaking tests. Of course, this depends on the time, like the duration of the class, but that's typically what it is. A couple activities. And this is why it's good to not just stick to IELTS and to also use TBLT, because if you stick to IELTS exclusively, then you're actually all of this form focus instruction could actually put your students into a box, and it could also generate anxiety. So I think that starting the lesson with a task, like a fun task, an activity, a game, could be a great way to increase their confidence level. At the end of the day, that's what we want. On IELTS, that's how a lot of students do well on IELTS. It's being a overall good English speaker or writer or reader or listener to a certain extent. Confidence and low anxiety is a massive part of this tool. So again, instead of just diving right into IELTS, I decide to reserve 3 or 4 minutes at the beginning to do an activity. Another tip, there are many free resources online and a lot of them are tainted. So definitely try to go through them and find out which ones are better to use and which ones aren't so good to use. I'll talk more about that in the future. The final one is to accept your limits. I've spoken about this before, about there could be limits in terms of your ability to deal with students who might have certain disabilities or whatnot. Recognize that even IELTS teachers have different styles. There are different ways to prepare your students for IELTS, even if you're using the exact same material. So your style might not be compatible with a particular student. Yeah, and I think accepting that and having a conversation with your student about that could be really beneficial. All right, I am out of things to say, so I hope that that has helped you out. This Friday, I'll publish another video talking about how to be an exceptional IELTS teacher, or what I consider to be a pathway towards exceptionality. I hope this has helped you. If there's anything that I forgot or anything else you would like for me to add in future lessons, please just put it down into the chat box below. Until next time, keep smiling.